Frank, one of the contentions that Bill Maher made is that, listen, Christianity, it's just a counterfeit of all these other Middle Eastern religions. Osiris and all this, virgin birth and raised from the dead. This is a story that is appropriated, and Christianity just copied other religions in the Middle East. How would you react to that?
Well, we have a whole section, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist about that. It's just not true. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true, okay? About the only dying and rising God prior to Christianity was Osiris from Egypt, and that wasn't a resurrection into a new body. That was a kind of ethereal resurrection into the underworld. That's not what the New Testament's talking about. In fact, almost all of these supposed dying and rising gods come after Christianity, not before. So if anyone's copying from anyone, it's not Christianity copying from pagan resurrection myths. It's the pagan resurrection myths copying from Christianity. But, you know, as C.S. Lewis also pointed out, just because you have a parallel between two stories doesn't mean one is copied from another. In fact, there was a ship, Charlie, I don't know if you heard about it. It made its maiden voyage from the UK back in the early 1900s. It hit an iceberg. A lot of people died. And of course, you're going to say, well, Frank, of course, that was the Titanic. Well, actually, it was actually a novel from, I think, 1898 called The Futility. And it predated the Titanic just by chance. Nobody would say, well, the Titanic story then must be copied from this novel called Futility. It just happened to be that there were parallels. So parallels don't necessarily prove that one is copying from another anyway.
And look, for example, a lot of the religions that overlap with Christianity, the overlap lines up with Christianity's rise, so they're just copying it. Like in Norse mythology, for example, there's a god Balder who dies and comes back and creates a paradise after an apocalypse. But almost certainly, this part of the myth was influenced by the spread of Christianity and was written down only in the Middle Ages. Another thing that Bill Maher mentioned in the discussion, and I didn't even know how to process this. I mean, in real time, Frank, I knew that this school of thought existed, but I thought it was only on Reddit or Discord channels, not in agreed upon high scholarly thinking. Did Jesus Christ actually exist, Frank Turek?
If there is one or two scholars out of many thousands, Charlie, in academia today who study this kind of material, and I'm not talking about, you know, Bible-believing Christians. There are atheists or New Testament scholars. If there's one or two out there, it's a lot who say Jesus never existed. I mean, think about this, Charlie. Jesus, inarguably, is the most influential human being to ever walk the earth. How could he possibly have never existed? It would be like somebody 2,000 years from now saying, Luke Skywalker is the most influential human being to ever walk the earth. Nobody 2,000 years from now is going to take a fictitious character and say that person is the most influential human being on the earth. Not only that, but there are non-Christian sources, and you began to talk about this a little bit in your interview with Bill, yes. Charlie. You didn't get a chance to complete the thought, but there are at least 10 ancient non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus's life that mention Jesus and or the apostles, people like Josephus, Suetonius, Thales, yes, Phlegon,
and Josephus the Talmud, was the name I forgot. I screwed up Herodotus and Josephus, but but that's a big one. Remind the audience who Josephus was. That's an extra biblical account of Jesus' life, non-biblical. Yeah.
Josephus lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD. And he wrote several books related to the Jews. One's called Antiquities, another is called, it's about the Jewish War is another one. And he mentions Jesus, he mentions John the Baptist, he mentions that James, the half-brother of Jesus, is killed as a martyr. He's the pastor of the church in Jerusalem, and he's killed in 62 AD. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, threw him off the Temple Mount, and then they stoned him to death. Now, this is the same guy, by the way, Charlie, who wrote that little book in the New Testament called James. He's also the same guy who did not believe his brother was God before the resurrection. But then James had Jesus appear to him, And that's why he converted, and that's why he was later executed by the Jews. So Josephus has a lot of great information on some of the New Testament events. But let me hasten to say this, Charlie. The best evidence for Jesus is in what we call the New Testament documents. And you don't have to assume that they are inspired to get good historical information out of them. Even atheists like Bart Ehrman, who teaches here where I am in North Carolina, UNC Chapel Hill, he admits that Jesus existed. He said probably one of the most attested to facts from ancient history is the crucifixion of Jesus. Of course, he doesn't believe in the resurrection, but there's virtually no scholars out there who say Jesus never rose from the dead, or I should say never existed, which is why when Bill tried to say that, it's completely off the rails.
And the other one, which I didn't quite grasp, and I did find that there was a school of thought out there that exists, but very fringe, that Paul was talking about a spiritual Jesus, that Paul, I just thought off the top of my head, I mean, 1 Corinthians, he talked about we will say that Jesus rose from the dead and that Jesus appeared to 500 believers. Where does this come from? And is there any merit to the argument that Paul was somehow not connected to, or he thought Jesus was just a spiritual celestial being?
No, because Paul makes it very clear that he's talking about a resurrected body, a body that comes out of the tomb. It would have been easy to say Jesus resurrected spiritually. Then you wouldn't have to, his body could still be in the tomb and you could still say, oh, he resurrected spiritually. But that wasn't the case. Jesus's tomb was empty, and it would have been easy to squash Christianity if it wasn't empty, because both the Romans and the Jews who didn't want Christianity to succeed would have gone to the right tomb and taken out his body. They didn't do it because his body wasn't in there. So no, this was a physical resurrection. And that's what made it so crazy to the Greeks, because they didn't think they didn't think anyone would want to have their body raised. They wanted to be liberated from the body. So when Paul is talking on Mars Hill, as recorded in Acts 17, and he's bringing up a physical resurrection, these guys over there are incredulous. They're going, we don't want that. We want to be liberated from the body. No, this was a physical resurrection. Christianity only makes sense if that's the case.